Interesting. See, we are a green organisation. At the end of the conference, can you please return your badges to the front desk? Let's cut down on the plastic to landfill. Okay, fantastic. Good morning, everyone. Gosh, I feel like a school teacher. My name's Louise Curran. I'm the chair of the Programming Committee. This is a precious occasion. I can see why Abby found it really quite a thing to stand up here and see you all. It's because the lights are shining straight in your eyes. What a great community this is. How exciting this conference program has been to bring together. I said yesterday that the program is largely an expression of who you are. Other than the keynotes, everything you're listening and hearing has come unsolicited from you. So it's pretty interesting where we are. Today's really exciting because we're going to talk about where we aren't. But before we do that, I just want to make a brief acknowledgement of country. We're here on Ngunnawal Ngambri country today, and I want to pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are here with us today and on the event's air in the virtual space. I'd really encourage you at home to post in the chat whose lands you're dialing in from. It's really helpful for all of us to get to increase our geographic understanding of the different countries of Australia and to rehearse their names. So speak them out loud if you're at home. So I also just want to acknowledge that I am an academic at Charles Sturt University. We're one of the last women standing in terms of the education environment. Lots of conversations about education. One of the really, really important things to recognise is that here with us today are students who really want to join us. They want to be part of us. And one of the routes to joining us from the outside looks like getting an education. So I also want you to note that I introduced myself as an educator, not a trainer. So I know that others in our community have really talked about that. There's a difference between education and training, and it's quite a precious thing to dwell deeply in this world of information, recorded information, and what it means for society. So be aware that these education institutions are ephemeral. So they need your support as much as the new initiatives the society seeks to make to broaden the ways people can join the community. So I think that covers the key things I really wanted to say. I want to now give you the notes for today. So return your badges at the end. The other one, don't forget to come along tonight to the Chief Minister's address, which is a Territory Records Office event. For those of you in Canberra, that's a bit of a VIP occasion. Come along, who come from Canberra. For those of you who are not from Canberra, really interesting chance for you to see the dynamics of the record-keeping community of Canberra. So I really encourage you to attend if you're here for the workshops tomorrow. The other one is make sure you sign up today if you want to be part of Adrian's UNESCO event on Friday. Closes off at midnight. Okay. So the other one is the ASA. I mentioned to you that we need to do a publication for the 50th anniversary. So we need to do a few publications. Why do we need to do this? Because we've gone open access with our journal, we need to have a permanent income stream. So we need to develop some more products for you all to buy. So in the meantime, what you can do is you can today buy some of our past publications. Made, Kept, Used, celebrating 30 years of the ASA and describing archives and context, a guide to the Australasian practices, a guide to the Australasian practice. So those are two separate publications. Describing archives and context may be a relatively old publication, but it's still pretty great. So also you can enjoy the kind of early 90s layout. So just go check it out. Your support of our society through these small but crucial measures like buying publications, contributing to making new ones is invaluable. Okay, so I feel like I spent a lot of time being a snake oil salesman. I'm going to be a snake oil salesperson now for something that I am truly passionate about. Like many of us, we volunteer. I currently partly volunteer for the higher education sector, but I primarily volunteer for the environment. I'm a park carer. I have learnt through this 10-year engagement with the land care movement and park care that our natural environment has some relationships with cultural heritage management. You find a lot of people in Canberra who come from cultural heritage who get involved in environment caring. And while at the moment we don't do RIFID IDs on our trees, there are different groups that do RIFID IDs on their seedlings. So there is a group in Wagga, for example, who do this in order to monitor progress of the plants that they put in the ground. One of my conundrums has been around this problem of evaluation. Lots of money gets spent on environment programs, but how effective are they? So I bring up this rather circuitous route to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Megan Evans. I'm really excited that Megan is here with us because she's an expert in, I want to pitch Megan at the right spot so that she's not frightened by my claim to her giant expertise. But this is an emerging field, understanding actually how do we measure our carbon footprint and how we are reducing it. So you've all heard people talk about how this conference is focused on here we are, which includes where we aren't. To my mind, this is the next frontier for the records and information community, is to get involved in this world of natural capital accounting. Okay, this is really going to be crucial. When I first contacted Megan, we were in a Scott Morrison world. In the Scott Morrison world, this was real core business because it was going to be an accounting model that delivered Australia's carbon reductions by 2050. The jury's still out on whether or not that's actually changed. Are we really going to see meaningful action? Does a forest constitute plants that are only this high, growing in the desert, irrigated? Is that really going to do anything for carbon reduction? Under the current rules, apparently, it will count. Is that right? So Megan was surprised by my invitation, but in our conversations, we have kind of managed to identify, like many outside our community, she's shocked and slightly excited to hear that there are people who have expertise around managing information for reliability and authenticity in order to deliver meaningful relationship to reality. It's quite exciting and challenging to me to try to explain what we do to people who don't have any idea what that is. So I'm not sure how successfully I've managed to pitch us to Megan and to really explain what it is we can offer her community, but I'm really hoping that this is the opening of a longer conversation with those involved in this really crucial path towards carbon reduction, which is just essential. And I don't know about all of you, but I certainly want to be in that transition. So Megan has lots of stellar credentials that you can read about in the program. She's part of the teaching staff at the UNSW Canberra campus. She's a DECRA fellow. Getting a DECRA is the holy grail for early career researchers. Bow down to Megan's powers that she secured one of these. You know, we can only get excited about the fact that people like Megan are actually looking closely at this area. So once again, yesterday I tasked people in the session I chaired with question preparation. Again, I'm going to task you all with just letting your minds wander while you listen to Megan about what your burning question is. Because this is a chance for us to have a dialogue. It's quite difficult, you know, because it's a little bit broadcasty with us up here and you down there. But we've got Stuart with the microphone. People on the chat away, because it's often easier to get the dialogue going in the digital space. Fortunately, we can bring your digital dialogue into the room. So knock yourselves out at home And without further ado, over to Megan.
Okay, I was told that I need to say when slides are to be shifted, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. The guys, I'm not sure if they're in Brisbane or they're there, but someone will move the slides.
Okay, so but the key message is don't touch.
I think that's right. Is that right? The guys on the back? Yeah, if you say next slide, please, they'll do it for you.
All right, I'm still going to touch my here just for my purposes, but yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. First, I want to acknowledge that today we're on the unceded country of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, the traditional custodians of these lands, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues in the audience and online. Now, Louise has kind of covered our initial conversation where I was delighted but also a little bit surprised by the invitation, and I freely admit that I'm not terribly familiar with your community. So my intention here is to tell you a little bit about my world and explain a little bit about some of the environmental policy and governance issues happening in Australia and overseas. Now, environmental markets are quite unique in that you're not actually trading a physical commodity. You're trading a credit or a certificate, which is, needs to be in paper or a digital form, that represents some kind of environmental benefit or a loss. And this all relies heavily on measurement and accounting, but also good governance. And I'll explain to you why both of these things are critical. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to start off by first explaining a bit of jargon. So natural capital essentially refers to the natural stocks, both living and non-living forms of nature, which deliver flows of ecosystem services that provide value to people. And these can be things like water filtration, pollination, and carbon sequestration. Biodiversity, on the other hand, refers to all living parts of nature, so the genes, species, and ecosystems. And natural capital as a term takes a fairly utilitarian and anthropocentric view of nature, where nature exists purely to provide benefits to humans. And that certainly doesn't align with all worldviews. It just happens to be the most relevant to what we're talking about today. Next slide, please. Now, some of you might have come across this term nature positive. And broadly, it refers to this commitment to halt and reverse nature loss, so in recognition of the huge dependence that human societies and economies have on nature. Next slide. For instance, this highly influential World Economic Forum report from 2020 produced this oft-reported statistic that 44 trillion of economic activity, or roughly half of the world's total gross domestic product, is either moderately or highly dependent on nature. Next slide. Now, this is a term that we're not just seeing in standard greeny environmental circles, but also via places like the World Economic Forum, like in the previous slide, but also places like the Australian Financial Review. So, from my perspective, once you've got the global cheerleader for a free market capitalism and famously left-wing news outlets like the AFR talking about biodiversity loss, there's something a bit different afoot. So this is absolutely a huge challenge. Next slide, please. And as you can see from this figure, in order to get to nature positive by 2030, there needs to be this complete reversal of current trends in nature loss, and evaluating our progress on this relies very heavily on accounting. We're already technically meant to be at zero net loss of nature at 2020, which I'm not entirely sure whether anyone has evaluated or even quite knows how to figure that out. Next slide, please. Now, related to this nature positive rhetoric is this growing role of the private sector in nature and biodiversity conservation. And this is one of many articles, again in the AFR, and reports which point to this so-called financing or funding gap, which is this shortfall between what is required and what is currently available to protect the environment. And the narrative goes that private finance is necessary to fill this gap because the public coffers can't possibly afford to do that. Next slide, please. And this has been explicitly repeated by our current Minister of the Environment, Tanya Plibersek, who said that governments cannot do this job alone. And this is because we need around 1 to 2 billion a year, so around 10 times what Australian governments currently spend, to adequately protect Australia's natural environments and the 2,000 or so species and ecosystems listed as threatened on our national environmental legislation. Now, if you're a cynic like me, you might say, well, $1 billion, how much is that really? It's about a tenth of the public money that's currently spent every year subsidising fossil fuel extraction and burning in this country. It's about a fifth of a failed submarine contract. And it's about half as much as what Australians spend on dog and cat food every year. But that is slightly beside the point of what I'm trying to communicate. Next slide, please. The point I'm trying to make is that this increased role of the private sector in nature and biodiversity conservation has profound implications for how species, water, land and air are governed, by whom and for what purpose. In terms of the how, in this worldview, markets are fundamental. So here's a few examples of environmental markets and programs that we currently have in Australia. Next slide, please. Now, environmental markets have been around for decades, but admittedly they've always been quite small and usually quite short-term, government-led, and where government is the primary purchaser of the product, which are environmental services. And now we're increasingly seeing privately led and governed markets, so like these three here on the right. Next slide, please. There's also quite a lot of hope that the private sector will become the primary purchasers in these markets. And there's a lot of work happening in government trying to attract private sector co-investment to fund biodiversity conservation efforts. And this was flagged also in Minister Plibersek's announcement of a national biodiversity market, where she expressed hope that one day Australia will house its own green Wall Street, where businesses from around the world can come and invest in environmental action. Next slide, please. There's also a lot of work happening to capitalise on or leverage existing environmental markets, existing carbon markets, to deliver biodiversity co-benefits, where carbon is the vehicle to achieve biodiversity outcomes, which I think there are certainly benefits, but there's also some big risks, which I'll explain shortly. Next slide, please. Now, you might have seen some news over the last year or so regarding Australia's carbon credit scheme, the Emissions Reduction Fund, or ERF. In June, the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen, announced that there was to be an independent review into Australian carbon credit units, or ACCUs, and that's being led by former Chief Scientist Professor Ian Chubb. And this came about after serious concerns have been raised and continue to be raised regarding the integrity of ACCUs. And while this is a pretty high-profile example, it's actually one that neatly highlights the importance of natural capital accounting and governance. Next slide, please. Now, the ERF has been around since 2015 and offers incentives for landholders. Oh, someone's playing with my computer, awesome. It's been around since 2015 and you can as a business or a landholder, you can deliver emissions reductions through a range of different methods. And these methods are statutory documents. The methods guide a range of different activities, from tree planting to, all the way to destroying methane emissions from piggeries and landfill operations. Now, in return for doing these activities, landholders and businesses are issued Australian carbon credit units, ACCUs, where one ACCU represents 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent. And these ACCUs can either be sold to the Australian government to help meet its own climate commitments under the Paris Agreement, or they can be sold to other businesses to meet their own climate commitments. Next slide, please. So here's this process in a little bit more detail, and I'm going to take this opportunity to have a little sip while you look at this beautiful diagram. Now, the Clean Energy Regulator, where this image is from, is the main body responsible for the Emissions Reduction Fund. They administer and enforce the legislation, the Carbon Farming Initiative Act. And since 2014, they've also purchased ACCUs on behalf of government. Since 2020, they have additionally developed methods that are used to generate ACCUs. In addition to that, they also provide the Secretariat for the Independent Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee. Now, in terms of governance, this is arguably a lot of hats for an independent regulator to wear. And myself and colleagues have argued that this introduces a lot of scope for conflicts of interests. We would rather see some of these roles, like purchasing and the method development, for instance, as well as the Secretariat for the Independent ERAC, move to other bodies like the Department or the Climate Change Authority. Next slide, please. Now here's a summary of activity to date under the ERF. So the far left circle showing that the government has committed around $2.7 billion to purchase carbon credits generated by landholders and businesses. Going to the right, this has purchased around 220 or 217 megatons of abatement across all method types. And out of all the method types, the vast majority of carbon credits have been generated from vegetation methods, so around 70%. Now, there's a range of different vegetation methods. Some involve planting trees directly, but others generate ACCUs by avoiding clearing in places where landholders previously held a right to clear, or by allowing the regeneration of forest where it's previously been suppressed by grazing or clearing or both. Next slide, please. But the big one out of all these vegetation methods is this one, called human-induced regeneration of a permanent even-aged forest, or HIR for short. This method accounts for around 30% of registered ERF projects, around 30% of all issued ACCUs, and is more than 50% of all ACCUs purchased by government, so worth around $1.5 billion. And this is one of the methods that has been subject to some of the integrity concerns that Professor Chubb and the independent panel are currently examining. And I've put some of the words in the title in bold because they're actually quite important, but because of the sheer length of the title, people usually just say human-induced regeneration. But the method needs to result in permanent forest so that there's a permanent removal of carbon emissions in the atmosphere. The forest should be even aged, and that means it's all growing from the same starting point, which implies that we're starting with a piece of land that doesn't have existing forest or vegetation. It's all growing from the same age. It's native, so which should be self-explanatory. We don't really want to sequester carbon by growing more weeds, not ideal. And finally, the vegetation needs to be forest, and that has a very specific definition. It needs to be at least 2 metres tall and 20% canopy cover, so a particular height and density to be considered forest, and the higher and more dense, the more carbon you're going to get. Next slide, please. Now for this, under this method to be eligible, the land must not have had forest cover in the last 10 years. And it is reasonable to expect, and I'm using air quotes because that's a direct quote from the method document, that things like grazing and clearing has suppressed vegetation growth and prevented the achievement of forest cover, so that removal of these suppressors, stop clearing, remove the cows, will allow that forest to regrow. Now, I'm going into a little bit of detail here, but I'm doing this to explain how the wording of this method, I think, quite clearly implies that this method is intended to be used in landscapes which had previously been cleared of vegetation in order to grow forest, right? Sounds simple. I'll finally just point out that this eligibility requirement, that land must not have had forest cover in the last 10 years, could actually be interpreted as being land that's never had forest cover. Right? It's quite different to requiring evidence that forest has been cleared in the past. Next slide, please. Now, this is a map of all active projects using the HIR method. The grey overlay shows where there is existing remnant vegetation, or in other words, vegetation that's never been cleared. The white areas are where native vegetation has previously been cleared, so in our agricultural zones. So we might have actually expected that projects that intend to grow forest cover occur in places where forests can be regrown. But as you can see, they are almost exclusively in the grey areas where there is existing remnant vegetation. And those grey areas largely occur where in semi-arid zones, so this is where the majority of projects are occurring, in semi-arid areas and some even in the middle of the desert. So there's a few in Alice Springs, or just south of Alice Springs, as you can see. Next slide, please. So this leads to one of the first key problems with how this method is being used. The obvious issue is that trees existed in these projects before the project began. There's a risk then that we're actually issuing more carbon credits than what is actually occurring in reality. Now, this might be something that improved measurements could help with, but carbon credits are actually issued to HIR projects according to modelled predictions of forest growth using a model called FullCAM, or Full Carbon Accounting Model. Next slide, please. So this is what this model looks like, the blue curve. Starting at 0 trees, we assume tree growth and the emissions that they sequester follow this curve. So this amounts, the bit at the right hand of the graph, that amount is the amount of emissions that we credit with Australian carbon credit units. Next slide, please. What happens when we already have trees on the land? Well, then regeneration follows a flatter curve because there's already some vegetation there, there's already some carbon sequestered, which is why that graph starts at a non-zero point. And this means that the amount of actual carbon sequestered is different to what is being modelled. It means that we're crediting ACCUs according to the blue curve, whereas in reality, sequestration is occurring according to the orange curve. So when you move those amounts together, if you just want to go to the next slide, shift those bits together, then you have an overcrediting issue where we're crediting more carbon abatement than is actually occurring. Next slide, please. The second problem is that in almost all projects, it's assumed that the removal of grazing, so livestock as well as feral animals, will allow vegetation to grow and reach forest cover because the other suppressor, that clearing is occurring, apparently hasn't occurred. Now, if livestock were the primary suppressor of vegetation growth, then presumably we wouldn't need to actively clear using, dozers and fire. We wouldn't need to actively clear 400 to 600,000 hectares of vegetation each year to create suitable pasture for livestock to eat. And the thing is, in these semi-arid areas where there's boom-bust environments, where trees grow and die depending on whether there's rain or drought, there are no tall, permanent, dense forests occurring in these semi-arid rangelands. Next slide, please. And it's for these reasons that my colleagues and I argue that carbon credits being issued to the majority of HIR projects do not actually represent what's happening in reality. ACCUs should only be issued where there is high confidence that the credited abatement is real and additional. And additional meaning we're actually delivering an outcome that wouldn't happen in absence of the intervention. We're not paying for something that would happen anyway. The bottom line is that when these low integrity carbon credits are used by firms to offset their own emissions, Australia's emissions will be higher than what they would otherwise be. I'll say that again. When we use carbon credits that actually represent less than 1 tonne of abatement to offset 1 tonne of abatement, we end up with a total of more emissions in total. Now, there's a couple of arguments put forward against some of what I've presented here. The first is that, in these environments, well, we use drones, we use LiDAR, we use big data, there's regular monitoring, reporting and routine audits to make sure everything is okay. The thing is, you could count every blade of grass on these sites, but that doesn't change the fact that ACCUs are being issued according to a model, and that model is being applied in locations where it's not calibrated to be used. And the CSIRO who developed the full CAN model have confirmed that this is the case. The second is, well, protecting this country, these semi-arid rangelands, is really important. And these carbon projects provide social and economic benefits for rural and regional Indigenous communities and outcomes of biodiversity. And I completely agree that this kind of country should be invested in for all of those reasons. My argument is that a carbon credit is not the appropriate policy instrument to deliver those outcomes. And this is because relying on low integrity carbon credits generated from these boom-bust environments to offset emissions, largely from fossil fuel extraction, essentially risks making climate change worse. Next slide, please. Now, you may be wondering how all of this relates to the nature positive discussion at the beginning of this talk. Now, the first thing is, as I flagged earlier, there's a huge push to leverage or to use carbon markets to deliver biodiversity benefits. And I think my example of the HIR method issue shows that there's risks in hitching your cart to one horse when it turns out that that horse is actually rather sick. The second thing is that the World Economic Forum and many others are actually seeking to replicate the success of carbon credits in the biodiversity space. And this briefing paper from the World Economic Forum came out just last month. Next slide, please. This is also very much the hope of the government, who has drafted legislation, or rather they're using legislation that the previous government drafted, to develop a national biodiversity market. And the way this legislation is drafted is that it entirely replicates our existing carbon credit scheme, the one that's currently under independent review for major integrity issues. Now, the findings of that review are not due to be released until the end of this year. But that didn't stop the government from making this announcement around a national biodiversity market and providing just 14 days last month for public consultation. The other elephant in the room is that we already have biodiversity markets, compliance-based biodiversity offset schemes that are used to compensate for regulated impacts on biodiversity. We already have a lot of those in Australia at the state and territory and the federal level, and they've occurred for between 20 and 30 years for some of them. So, and there's a whole other talk where I could talk about biodiversity offsets. It's my favourite, also most hated topic. But suffice to say, there's a lot of problems with biodiversity offset schemes, and even though the focus is on accounting, I would argue that most of these issues are due to failures in governance. Now, some colleagues and I recently did an international review of biodiversity offset schemes around the world. Next slide, please. Out of over 100 jurisdictions, we found only 9 jurisdictions where any public information is provided into their operation. So 9 registers out of 100 schemes where there's publicly available information. These registers don't actually provide the sufficient or right kind of information to actually answer the key question underpinning biodiversity offsets. Do they actually compensate adequately for biodiversity loss? Do they deliver a no net loss outcome? There's a lot of information provided in these registers, including links to very large PDFs with a lot of monitoring data, but they're not the very specific and actually quite concise pieces of information to know whether a biodiversity gain has equalled a biodiversity loss. Next slide, please. So to conclude, quite frankly, we need all the help we can get if this nature positive ambition, which Australia has now committed to, has any chance of being met. And given its utter reliance on good governance of information, I suspect this community has some very important contributions to make. Thank you.
So much worse than we all thought. So you have to, I don't know how we're going to do this. I just have to check one thing, Stuart. How long do we have? Oh, we've only got 5 minutes. Oh my goodness, I must have said too much at the beginning. Okay, so I'm going to ask you then if you've got a burning question.
Hi, Louise. I have a burning question.
Great. Mrs. Michaela.
Hi, Megan. Thank you very much for that. I'm a senior government archivist and also a member of Project ARC, which is archivists responding to climate change. My quick question is it enough? And other than lobbying for an integrity commission, what else can we do?
Great question. I mean, there's a lot of, opportunities to engage in environmental policy in this country. I mean, in fairness, the previous consultation was 14 days. Yeah, I would, if this community is interested in this conversation, this discussion around the national biodiversity market is going to be ongoing. I don't expect that the government will get to dealing with the legislation in Parliament this year. I think submissions to the independent review into ACCUs is closed, but I'm sure if you wanted to put in a submission you could. But generally speaking, sorry? We might know someone. So the Ecological Society of Australia and the Society for Conservation Biology are the two peak bodies, professional bodies in this space, as well as the Environment Institute of Australia and New Zealand. So there might be some linkages there.
I think a crucial first step is for us to really understand what the integrity problem is and what the gap is between reality and the record keeping, so that we can understand where we can make a contribution, because to me that is shocking, really shocking. So Michaela, I don't know if you want to say more? No. Anyone else? Burning question?
Yeah, we have an online question.
Yep.
This question's from Deb Liego. Are you suggesting that HIR as a methodology should be abolished or modified?
So, look, I mean, if it's that there's particularly legislative restrictions on what can be done to the method, and the thing is, if you close a method, then there's still all of the existing projects that are allowed to continue on that method. So it's not going to solve that particular issue. And we also need to acknowledge that all of those landholders and businesses who have engaged in that project have done so in good faith. They have done so, following the advice of the regulator and of the intermediaries. So, we need to think about those equity issues as well. There's a couple of, particular recommendations. One of the things that occurred when the Emissions Reduction Fund was first introduced was that the CFI Act was watered down such that methods do not actually have to meet offset integrity standards. The minister only has to have regard to offset integrity standards. So there's a fairly quick but profound change that could be made to legislation so that this kind of problem isn't replicated again.
Also really interesting to note there the role of the regulator. So some of you will have an insight into the clean energy, I've forgotten the name of the agency. Some
Clean
of
Energy
you,
Regulator.
The Clean Energy Regulator, and how effective it is in terms of its records performance. National Archives people will have an understanding of that. And that's possibly another place where we can bring our sharp lens to bear. Anyone else? Burning question?
Yeah, hi Megan, thanks for that. My name's Simon, I work at the National Gallery, and I just had a question about the carbon capture storage method of injecting it actually into the ground, and I know there's been debate around that effectiveness, and I was wondering if you had thoughts on that and whether or not credits are given for that and how that might work.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. That is slightly outside of my area of expertise, so I can't really comment too much. I think there has been, CCS was, the government was seeking to make a method out of that. But again, the issue comes back to whether or not that meets the offset integrity standards and whether or not the legislation requires that method to actually meet them. So additionality is the key issue. Would firms have used that method to reduce their emissions anyway? Because we don't really want to pay public money to private firms to do things that they would do as an economic issue themselves.
Okay,
We've got time for one more
we've got
question.
time for one more. Have we got anything else burning digital? Otherwise, Fiona's got a question.
Hi, I'm Fiona. I'm like Louise. I volunteer on a local re-veg project here in Canberra. And we're revegetating an area that has been cleared, blah, 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 although it's just along a creek corridor. Is there any way that what we do actually feeds into that, could be considered a HR, and how would we feed into the record keeping?
Yeah, right. There is scope to use a method, whether it's HIR or environmental plantings is another one, to use that as a method. The issue is that this scheme is hideously complex, and it often requires a specialist expertise, and there are businesses who develop that specialist expertise, intermediaries like carbon service providers, who typically carry out those services for a fee. And that means that they won't necessarily take on projects that are quite small scale. So I guess for you, it depends on, is it worth my time to become an expert in this method and the operation of this scheme to potentially help pay for this project through the use of carbon credits? And am I okay with carbon credits being generated from this project potentially being purchased by somebody or a firm that I might not especially want them to use my credits?
Okay, fantastic. So I think we have to leave it there. So your homework now is to follow up on the outcomes of that Chubb review. Is that right?
Yes.
That's the review we need to watch. Because now we've got some understanding of what's at stake in that review. And then I guess our next piece of homework will be to go and find out more about actually what those auditors look for. So hopefully someone will give a paper on this next year. So Megan, we can't thank you enough for doing the patient work to translate your expert knowledge into something that we can connect with. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now I believe it's morning tea, is that right? No. There's a 15-minute break for the rooms. I should know that. After all, it was my idea. Okay, excellent. Wow, so much to digest. Thank you.